All right, so let's move on then to that first objection against the Bible. It runs something like this. The Old Testament God was a wicked tyrant who commanded horrible things. You hear this objection a lot today, especially with the new atheist types.
Well now, if you're going to talk about what we supposedly claim, you should at least know who we are. I mean, the phrase new atheist is merely an attempted insult targeted towards a demographic who no longer feels threatened enough from what has historically been a violent and sometimes even fatal lashback from the religious segment of society. This is true, at least to a reasonable degree. They no longer feel that they must remain silent when the religious invade their personal rights and liberties. However, individuals and even entire families are still being harassed by contemporary Christians, some to the point that they have to leave their homes for fear of their continued safety. This was highlighted in 2015 in America by the case of the Woodrow Wilson Elementary School. Children were being coerced into religious practices and the receiving of a Bible by a teacher. The mother of one such child then reported the case to the American Humanist Association, who contacted the school over the breach of the Establishment Clause found in the American Constitution, i.e., Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. A school coercing students into Christianity is a clear breach of the separation between church and state. A teacher is free to their religious beliefs and their practices, yet not on state time and pay. They are there to teach, not to preach. The local Christian response to the mother, meanwhile, led her to fear for her child's safety, so much in fact that she had to withdraw them from said school before placing their house up for sale. Now thankfully, this is in the rare box, this is the rare instance, but back during the Cold War, being non-religious could have you ostracized or even reported to the police under suspicion of being a communist. Go back further yet, and you could in fact be put to death. Nowadays, most non-religious individuals in the West no longer have to fear this, and thus no longer have to take your continued invasion of their personal rights silently. That is what you refer to as a new atheist. A person no longer scared of you so much to allow you to abuse them as Christianity has done and is still doing to this day.
What they like to do is, kind of go into the Old Testament and find some morally questionable passage, at least they think, and they're going to use that as leverage to kind of undermine the whole Bible. So they'll say something like, oh, you see this horrible thing your God commanded here in the Old Testament. Well, that's obviously wrong, immoral, blah, blah, blah. Therefore, your whole God doesn't exist, or the Bible's just all bunk, or whatever. So it's that kind of approach that this objection is taking here.
If you actually wish to prepare those studying your course to be capable of defending the Bible, it may be wise to avoid giving such a wishy-washy demonstration of the opposing argument. Simply utilizing a short and condensed example, such as the problem of evil enacted directly through the Bible, would suffice, followed by the disclaimer that this is not always the case or the form it takes, but it is in fact one form. By enacted directly through the Bible, I mean the presentation of the problem of evil, which does not rely on what we see in nature or human history, but purely based on what we see written in the text of said scripture. This can often be the most direct route to take when tackling an apologist.
Now you have to know that this objection can take a lot of forms. What I mean is, there are a lot of passages like that they can point to. There are a whole bunch of these sorts of things in the Old Testament, and we just don't have the time here in this short course to go through it each possible passage in the Old Testament and go through a deep interpretation of each one. We don't have the time to do that. It's a good thing, and there are a lot of books that do that. I recommend one by Paul Copan called Is God a Moral Monster? That's one good example of a book that goes into a lot of these sorts of passages. We don't have the time to do that in this short course. What I'm going to do instead is kind of recommend to you a general sort of catch-all response. This is a response that I think that works for all these passages, or at least most of them. So this is my general catch-all response, and it's a three-step process. It's a three-step process. And what you do is you take any objection from the Old Testament. Let's just call it X for just for an abbreviation. X. This passage here, X. All right. This is what we're talking about here.
Somewhat understandable. However, you should be able to go over at least one example and take it through your 3 steps as a live demonstration to its effectiveness. This case study would act to bolster your argument considerably without taking up as much time as doing all of the passages one by one, as I have to agree that there are a great deal of questionable segments in the Old Testament. The mere replacement of such a case study with X really flags up doubts as to whether this argument will work at all or even have any substance.
And there are 3 important things we need to consider. Okay, number 1, did God actually command X? Whatever it is in the Old Testament, did God actually command that? That's an important question we have to ask up front, because if God didn't command it, then it's not really an issue relevant to the discussion at hand, right? So we have to ask, did God actually command this? Because I guarantee you, a lot of times, skeptics will say, this bad thing here happened in the Old Testament. See, your God commanded evil. And then when you go and read the passage just saying what someone did. It doesn't say that God actually commanded them to do that. It's just reporting on some bad action that a person in the Old Testament did. So this isn't an argument against such a God's existence, is it? Because in this case, God wouldn't have commanded that bad act in the first place. So if God didn't really command any alleged immorality here, well, then there's nothing to explain. So that's the first one in my general catch-all response, is you have to look and see, all right, well, did God really command X or whatever it is in question? You have to ask that first.
Well, that's not really a valid objection, as you clarified in the start that this was a response to instances where God is calling for X, e.g. the slaughter of the Midianites in Genesis chapter 31, or acting out X directly, e.g. in taking away the Pharaoh's free will in Exodus before plaguing all the people of Egypt repeatedly, ending in at least the death of every firstborn male child, from the highest lord to the lowest servant, who, by the way, has no control over the before-mentioned lords. And the lords even themselves have no control over the Pharaoh, only God does apparently, because he hardened the Pharaoh's heart. This would be like turning up to a weapons defense class and the teacher going, in most instances, they won't have a weapon. Yeah, okay, I can understand that, but that's not why we are here. However, even if this were the case, even if it wasn't valid that God ordered or acted out this directly, the argument is actually still valid in numerous contexts. Take, for example, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, yet more importantly, who God spares. Lot offers his daughters to the mob that appears in front of his house because apparently the raping of women is favourable to the raping of men. Meanwhile, the third option of prayer, or the fourth option of barricading the doors and windows, never occurs to said apparent only man worth saving from the 2 cities above all the poor, disabled, and newborn. God may not have ordered this specific aspect, yet they never hold Lot accountable for his actions. I mean, to merely look at your neighbour's wife with lust is already a sin which must be atoned for. but this apparently is not worth acting upon.
The second one is if God really did command X, if he really did command that, when you go and you look at the passage and it says, well, God commanded this, okay, fine. You have to ask, all right, if that happened, was it truly immoral for God to do so? If God really did command X, was it truly immoral for him to do so? In other words, we have to get into this discussion of what kind of act would it be wrong for God to command? What's the standard for right and wrong anyway? You see, if you're going to say something is immoral, well, that involves a whole lot of these sorts of questions. If you want to say God did something that was morally wrong, what would it mean for God to do something morally wrong? For example, I mentioned here in your text, if God, say, chooses to take someone's life, is it wrong for God to do that? If God chooses to take away someone's property, is it wrong for God to do that?
Well, first of all, I must make it absolutely clear that this depends less on my own concept of morality, but rather the Bible's. An idea is found to be self-contradictory, not by comparison between two ideas of separate origins, but of rather a single origin. I note this as a common and invalid response to what I'm about to say is often to attack the atheist and their morality rather than tackle the argument. Now, most Christians, to my knowledge, subscribe to the idea that morality is objective, and thus as objective morality, it is not subject to the time, culture, or entity carrying out the action. If it were, it would then become subjectively moral, as said morals would be subject to other aspects, such as the identity, time, or culture. From this, to claim that X is immoral for one entity with supposed free will would then mean that X is equally immoral for all others, whether they be peasant, king, or God. The very existence of a system which gives preference to one such party on matters such as murder and rape is skewed and typically viewed as immoral itself. For one thing, it is certainly not just, and therefore anyone who implements such a system cannot be all just. For in the eyes of justice, all must be judged the same. And yet the only possible way to get out of this would be to class God as amoral, i.e. his actions are neither good nor bad, but then you may dissolve the rest of Christian theology, as you cannot claim Jesus and his actions as good, merely actions which supposedly were. This is why you can't claim the actions of most animals to be moral or immoral, as these concepts have no meaning to them. A shark does what a shark does, not because they are immoral, but simply because it's in their nature. Some other higher apes display behaviours that can be discussed in the realm of morality, but it's not as simple or clear as with us. Yet, for a god to claim X is moral or immoral, they must have knowledge and thus meaning given to these things, removing them from this defence. If God becomes amoral, then they have no right to declare moral guidelines. This is why we don't get our morality from how natural processes work, such as the weather formation, gravity, and biological evolution, because they just are and thus lack a sense of right and wrong. We, on the other hand, have some sense of this, and thus we have founded the philosophy of ethics.
Don't all things ultimately belong to God anyway? Isn't all life a gift from God anyway? You see, so you get into some problematic issues by saying, oh, God did this wrong thing here in the Old Testament. You get drawn into deep discussions like this. Aquinas, for example, St. Thomas Aquinas, he didn't think that God did anything wrong in the Old Testament at all. He explains it this way. He says, whatever is taken by the command of God, to whom all things belong, is not taken against the will of its owner, whereas it is in this that theft consists. So Aquinas' point here is that if God owns all things, if he's the creator of all things, he's the author of all life, he's the owner of everything in the universe, is it wrong for him to take things away? Isn't that the whole definition of theft or murder in the first place, is to unjustly take something away from someone? So my point is, and we're not going to get into the deep discussion on this, but my point is that this sort of issue is involved with the objection, because the objection presupposes that God has unjustly acted in some way in that Old Testament passage. But what does it mean for God to unjustly act in a certain way? So if it turns out that God didn't command anything wrong in the first place, which would be Aquinas' opinion, right? This is Aquinas' view that God never did anything wrong in the first place here because he owns all things. Well, if God didn't do anything wrong in the first place in this particular passage X, well, then the objection just fails right here. So,
well, there are indeed a number of issues here. The big number one is that ownership of people is slavery. Thus, if God owns us, this then sets the objective standard of human ownership to okay, for again, if morality were subjective to the entity, it would cease to be objective morality. Secondly, not all evil or harm takes things away. Consider pain itself. Pain isn't merely the absence of happiness or joy. It is a positive emotion in that it stands alone and is not merely the absence of something else. Going back to the slaughter of the Midianites, the virgin girls were spared and then turned into sex slaves to be raped and even married to the very men who had butchered their families under God's orders. And then we have the Egypt case. We have all the pain and suffering caused through the various plagues. Third, if God gave us life, then that does not mean that the giving of said life makes it okay to simply take life away. If I gift you something and then just take it without your permission, that does not then stop the action from being thievery. Fourth, even if we are gods, that does not then prevent these actions from being harmful and thus less than loving. If you define God as omnibenevolent as a Christian, then whether they own us or not is irrelevant beyond the fact that it's slavery, and slavery is not love. But again, it is irrelevant, as if a child broke their toy on purpose, you would not say that they loved that toy. Thus, if God merely sees us as disposable items, this argument nullifies the claim that the crucifixion was the ultimate act of love to humanity, refuting the very core belief of Christianity, so it seems. That is, unless you say that God changed his ever-unchanging mind about us, people.
Again, this is our kind of a secondary concern in my general catch-all response. The third part, though, of my general catch-all response is like, all right, suppose someone says, okay, yeah, all right, we got through the first part, God really did command this, and the second part, well, yeah, all right, technically it wasn't immoral for God to do so, but still, it kind of bothers me, or kind of bothers the objector. They just don't like it. That's not really an argument, by the way, but it's just something bothers them about God commanding this act. Even if, technically speaking, it wasn't morally wrong for God to command that, still, they just don't like it for some reason. Is there anything we can say about that, even though it's not technically an argument, just because you don't like something? If God didn't do anything immoral, then the objection has already failed.
Which is fine, as you fail to do such a thing and argue your case. Ergo, you merely repeating the claim like some mantra is just an exercise in psychological masturbation. Holding to Christian standards of morality, being God does not then skirt around the definition of objective unless you actively redefine him as amoral. Yet if you do this, morality, when in discussion relating to God, is simply rather pointless. Now, due to the fact that this video was slightly longer than your other lessons, I will stop here for now and pick up where I left next time. I'll see you then.